So back to the theme of Canada thinking for itself. Really, how? What's to be done? One of the reasons Global Brief was created back in 2009 is that what used to frustrate me to no end is that I used to look at leading Canadian decision makers in foreign affairs particularly, but also in social policy, put up with one hand the magazine The Economist, and in the other foreign affairs, or it might be foreign affairs and foreign policy, and they would say, this is the state of the debate. Oh, look what The Economist has written. Look at what foreign affairs has written. And what they didn't realize, and I think what we still don't realize often when we put up these examples, is that we outsource our thinking to the thinkers of another country. Yeah. And in many cases, those thinkers are neither impressive nor relevant to the Canadian condition, to Canadian questions. And yet we outsource and then we defer and we take advice or prescriptions from these platforms. And again, that situation is exacerbated today where when the United Kingdom and the US are in particular unimpressive, generally and for Canadian purposes in particular. But more searingly, what used to annoy me is that we didn't have our own counter thesis. Why wouldn't we say, well, here's what Canada thinks, here's what leading Canadian thinkers think across the board, and here's our platform. And by the way, we're going to prescribe to these other societies and countries because we'll be the term setters. We'll have the reputation and the wherewithal, the seriousness, the gravitas to be able to be the leading platform of ideas. But we didn't offer that counter thesis. We never even asked the first principles question. Why don't we have it? And Global Brief was a modest response to that. We've been quite successful, disproportionately so. But since then, I've been constantly asking, and a lot of my work is informed by that. How do we become more of a term-setting country across the board of policy questions? Across the board in questions of the human condition, of the good life, yeah. In economic questions, in commercial questions, in scientific and environmental questions, in social and ethical questions. This is a question of mentality, of resources, and of course of the persistence, the stubbornness to keep asking that question and to drive your own terms. And by the way, to resist subordination to terms that you automatically find unimpressive because you have a trained mentality to do so. Trained like, by the way, the Singaporeans and the Israelis do. They never defer to foreign terms. They automatically say, well, why should I listen to them? I'm Singapore. I'll drive the terms. I'll take from all these other countries. I'll re-engineer it, and I'll drive Singaporean terms. And I'll have everybody come here to this small country, and it'll be a hub for ideas. Yeah? And my citizens will be well educated and live well. I'm not doing a hagiography, but that is a particular type of mentality that we need to build in Canada, one that is befitting a huge country territorially with a very, very large, increasingly large population. 38 million, heading towards 50 million soon. Maybe one day 100 million. But it's the thinking that matters. Right now we don't have the right thinking. And let me prove that to you. I started this micro set of lectures on Canada thinking for itself by saying that in the literature space, online and in print, we're outnumbered completely in ratio terms by foreign, in particular American stimuli, causing us to not think at all, or thinking we're thinking, but really parroting things that are of foreign provenance. Give you the example. You wake up in the morning to an alarm on your iPhone. You listen to the news, you read the Facebook feed, you read the Twitter feed, you might your LinkedIn feeds, Instagram. These are all American algorithms driven by their brilliance. We interpret it for our daily reality. We retweet as if it's our own, and therefore we get Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Donald Trump dominating our discourse. I turn on the radio. You might have the national broadcaster CBC on the radio or in the television mode. I admire all of the journalists. However, they are increasingly subsumed to that same ratio in our disfavor. And then they start offering us stories that are really of American provenance for the Canadian condition, which have nothing to do with us. You know, why are we listening to Hollywood kitsch or American political stories, even amongst the top 5 in the newscast on a regular basis, when we have a country of 38 million that's second largest in the world, because we're not thinking consciously for ourselves, or we're not mindful in a stubborn way for ourselves. We can't even muster the vocabulary over time because that vocabulary is bombarded by these foreign sources. By the way, this is not an anti-American lecture. I'm the biggest admirer. I'm a huge admirer of the American condition. Yeah. Even if in its current diminished state. Good on them. What about us? Can we muster the right vocabulary, frameworks, and imagination to offer ourselves some intellectual content for our own problems? That is a question of, first of all, mentality. So let's resolve to do this in the social media space. Canadians, let us not blindly quote from an American source just because it's in front of us. Yeah. Try to find a Canadian quote that's of a value. Going back to our forefathers, the fathers of the Confederation, up to our current political, cultural, intellectual, business class, our sporting class, find content and invent content and add to it that is properly Canadian. That is not a CanCon pitch, that is a pitch for something that represents our circumstances. Don't just mindlessly tweet and repost the last American popular declaration or enunciation. Right? That's a habit of mind. Be stubborn. The same thing when we hear a Canadian political leader quote Barack Obama or Donald Trump or George Bush or Lincoln or Kennedy. Kennedy is very, very popular. Ask yourself, why are we constantly doing that? Why is there a deference to American rhetoric and American political philosophy and political theory as opposed to the Canadian one? Well, of course, the answer is that we haven't convinced ourselves of the worthiness of our own political theory en masse. We're not sufficiently educated in it and aware, and we're bombarded by it so that we're not thinking about it. Be conscious of it. Would Angela Merkel ever quote from Kennedy? Would Xi Jinping quote from AOC? Would leading figures in Asia, Europe, and the Americas quote from foreign countries on an active basis? No, it's largely a Canadian phenomenon caused by increasingly non-thinking. Now, enough about social media. Let's move to the sporting world, my favorite world. I'm a former athlete. I follow this closely. Of course, I can't participate at the elite level anymore, but I have a political, policy, sociological, cultural interest. And as a Canadian, I shed tears. I may be a fan of the Toronto Raptors like many other people. I applaud the victory, but we have a problem again of non-thinking in Canada when we evaluate even that victory. And I'll repeat it for the other sports as well. In the NBA, there are 30 teams, okay, 30 teams, run out of New York City, an American league. We have one team, the Toronto Raptors. Right? That's supposed to be Canada's team. For a population, by the way, of 38 million, we have one team in an American-run league of 30 teams, where there is only one Canadian player. Okay? One Canadian player. And that is our achievement? Is that the best we can do? And the answer, of course, not. And the question is, why are we so content? Because in many ways it is an example of Canadian non-thinking. We are plugging into an architecture designed by our brilliant American cousins. They created the league, they created the framework that gave us a team, they populated the team mostly with their talent, on their terms, by the way. It's an American league. We offered the consumption, the fan base. We offered one player, we won, we called it a national achievement. Okay? That's essentially the more brutal logic. If you don't accept it, let's see it in another sport. In the MLB, Major League Baseball, we have 30 teams again, run out of the United States. We have one Canadian team, the Toronto Blue Jays. On that team, there are one or two, I think two today, with Vladdy Guerrero Jr., two Canadian players. Okay? And again, if they win, they might be Canada's team again. Okay? Is that befitting a country of 38 million? Yeah. Now, you might say up here, the Toronto Raptors, one, they inspired a whole generation of players, young Canadians, to play basketball. And I agree with you, yeah, including my own kids. And I want to play basketball as well. I want to be a Raptor one day. The question is, where will these Canadians play? The architecture is designed by the Americans. The terms of employment, even on the Raptors, are driven by American conditions, by American, generally, basketball conditions. The same thing in baseball. And so we plug in at the margins. Are we to say that 38 million population is producing people for these 2, 3, 4, 5 spots? Is that the best we can do? No, I want us to think on a term-setting basis and create our own architecture, to which I'll return, because it applies not just in sport, it applies in other elements of culture, business, politics, science, environment, and so on. It's a mentality. It is an exercise in thinking, in being very mindful of the Canadian condition, and thinking about Canada as something important. Let's go to, of course, the best sport in the world, soccer. I'm a former soccer player. I played in 1997 for the Toronto Lynx, which was one of 3 teams two teams in a North American league at the time. By the way, populated mostly with excellent Canadian players, Dwayne DeRosario, Paul Stalteri, Irvin Studin. However, MLS, an American construction, brilliant American marketing, is a very successful and incredible, I would say, middle-of-the-line soccer league in global terms today. It has 24 teams, created after the 1994 World Cup by Alan Rothenberg, the American World Cup. Good on the Americans. I applaud them. It's been a boon for their soccer performance, and also it attracts great players from around the world. What is the Canadian portion of MLS? Well, we have 3 teams. And one of them, of course, is the Toronto FC, Toronto Football Club. And still, because the Americans run the architecture, Toronto FC is largely populated by American players. Right? Canadian players are much better represented than 1 or 2. There might be, I would say, 5 or 6, maybe 7 players on there. Good on them. There are some good players on them. I applaud them. However, again, what is the Canadian contribution to this? We are plugging into an American framework and calling it a day. Yeah? We either call it a day, or indeed we call it a national achievement if we do very well. Right? But it is largely an exercise in really non-thinking. We are not doing the thinking. Yeah. We are subordinating to the thinking of the United States, or plugging into it mindlessly, or outsourcing, whatever word you want to use. Even in ice hockey, it finds this example, because there is a National Hockey League with 31 teams. We have 7 Canadian teams. Now, the majority of the players, I would say 50% to 60%, are Canadian, because Canadians are genius hockey players. But on the architecture side, we only have 7 of 30, which means we don't run the terms of the league, and we don't even determine the terms on which our national team represents us internationally. Remember, we didn't show up to defend the gold medal in the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2016 because the Americans, because they run the architecture, they run the terms out of New York, said, nay, you Canadians, you will not show up. And we had no counterbrief. Again, non-thinking in the context in which we really should be thinking. We should be running the show in hockey. But to run the show means you need to design the architecture. Yeah? Otherwise, the puppet master or the superior brain is running it. And in the event, the superior brain is in the United States. And good on them. But what happens when they're unimpressive? Well, what happens when they're foolish or incoherent, as they are in many cases today? Yeah. Is that what we call the superior brain? Is that what should inform the Canadian condition on the ground? So here's my happy counterbrief. The CFL, the new Canadian Premier League in soccer, the Canadian Elite Basketball League, applause. We need more of that. We need that to be generalized across the sports. We need it to be supported by corporate Canada, by government as well. It's not always a market question. It is a question of national institutions, right? And finally, we need Canadians to believe. We need to believe in our own architecture, right? And not be in a general delirium of non-thinking. So here's where we go in sports. The Canadian Premier League in soccer, the CFL, higher level, and the Canadian Elite Basketball League. Let's build on all of these basic touchstones, and let's generalize. Let's believe in ourselves, and let's scale properly. Because a proper country institutionalizing sport, as it does with other elements of culture nationally, should imagine a Whitehorse competing against Halifax, or Yellowknife competing against Toronto, and of course Toronto, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, Toronto, Hamilton, on a regular basis. Why should I be watching Hockey Night in Canada but suffer Jacksonville against Tampa Bay every second year? Right? Why should we suffer San Jose against Nashville? Yeah. And then go cap in hand and ask New York whether they will offer us a new franchise? The proper vision for a big country with a sizable and growing population, 38 million, remember, second largest country in the world, with a long history, 152 years, 53 years of stable governance, a global reputation. The proper vision in sport really is that within 5-10 years, we ought to have leagues across the sports, in hockey, in baseball, yes, in basketball, in volleyball, in soccer, where you have Halifax playing Toronto regularly, Whitehorse playing Vancouver, Yellowknife playing St. John's, Hamilton playing Quebec City, Saskatoon playing Winnipeg, and so on a regular basis. These are much more interesting derbies and rivalries, of course, than the ones that I have to suffer when I watch Hockey Night in Canada, the NHL playoffs, every June, whereby Nashville plays Tampa Bay or San Jose plays Jacksonville. What is that? Why should we suffer that? Right? And why indeed should we suffer the idea of one team in these American-run leagues and call it a day when we're more or less successful? I call that aw shucks nationalism. That is to say, we're pushed in a small box. That box is smaller than our proper proportions, and we glorify that very small telos. Aw shucks, aren't we cool, right? We can think much more macro, we can dictate the terms, and in many cases this has real consequence for our well-being. I've talked about that in the past. Now on social media and our national broadcaster, let me close there. On social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, from the consumption side is very attractive. And I can understand how it's fun to use, we're connected, we're plugged in, but for the national discourse, for the national condition, we must become much more muscular in regulating and controlling these platforms in the Canadian interest. And the control and regulation must not be from a privacy perspective only. That is the main axis on which we're tending to regulate today, but it's very partial. The more important one, to my mind, is the one about national literacy, national content, national terms under which content comes into the Canadian space and is read by Canadian readers. Because if we're not controlling and regulating that properly, and in many cases offering a muscular counter-thesis, then we are essentially allowing the American mass, through demographic superiority, 330 million people to our 38, right, with all the multipliers consolidated by their having created the algorithms to begin with in California, enforcing the terms of our own debate, so that Canada begins essentially to talk about what's happening in Baltimore or LA, and that becomes the vernacular on the street in Iqaluit or Charlottetown, which is an absurdity. But it's an absurdity because we will have allowed it to happen, and we will have been mindless in absorbing it. And before long, even our decision makers won't know how it all went wrong. They won't be able to muster the vocabulary. So we need to be much more muscular and deliberate there, like other countries, by the way, are, including democratic countries. Final point on our beloved national broadcaster. I do a lot of work with CBC. I'm a big fan of it in general. Shout out to Carol McNeil, on whose terrific show I do numerous interviews. She's one of our treasured journalists. I want to say that broadcaster must not just be excellent, it must be bigger and better and more prolific nationally and globally. That is the correct vision and counterweight that we must offer to the present cacophony online, in print, and in the television space. The answer is not to make CBC exclusively online or to make it work on the cheap. The answer is for it to be the best in the world and one of the biggest in the world, globally and domestically. Go big, or we might not have a national discourse at all in a couple of years.